Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku rose as the hero of a world without light? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in the iron wreckage had a taste, rust, damp concrete, and the faint, metallic tang of old blood that had long since soaked into the earth. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the taste of home. He lay flat on his stomach, the coarse grit of a collapsed overpass pressing into the patched fabric of his jacket. Below him, the skeletal remains of Mizurufu sprawled out in a labyrinth of perpetual twilight. There was no sun. Not anymore. There was only the lightless sky, a bruised, violet-gray ceiling that stretched from one horizon to the other, a permanent monument to the day the world broke. The eclipse, they called it. A cataclysm born from a quirk so monstrous it had torn the sun from the sky, leaving civilization to crumble in the ensuing darkness. That was 16 years ago. Izuku had been born into the gloom, a child of the dusk. To him, stories of a brilliant, warm yellow orb were just that, stories, as fanciful as the legends of flying men in bright costumes who had once saved people. He adjusted the scavenged binoculars, the lenses scratched and cloudy. His gaze wasn't on the horizon, but on the street 30 feet below. His target, the old Might Mart convenience store. Its windows were long shattered, its colorful logos faded to ghostly pastels. More importantly, its basement storeroom, according to a pre-eclipse city schematic he'd salvaged, was reinforced concrete, a potential jackpot for preserved goods. It was also, however, prime hunting ground. A low, wet clicking sound echoed from the far end of the street, and Izuku froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He didn't need the binoculars to know the source. A gloom fong. It emerged from the shadow of a toppled bus, a contorted mockery of something that might have once been canine. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over a frame of mismatched bones. Its legs bent at unnatural angles, allowing it to scuttle with a horrifying, insect-like gait. But its most defining feature was its head, which split open vertically into a cavernous maw filled with needle-like teeth, a fleshy, bioluminescent lure dangling from the roof of its mouth. They were drawn to sound, to light, to the faintest scent of the living. They were the apex predators of the new world. Izuku's breath itched, but he forced it into a slow, silent exhale through his nose, a technique he practiced until it was second nature. Panic is a noisemaker, he thought. The phrase a mantra drilled into him by years of survival. He pressed himself flatter against the concrete, the worn leather cover of the notebook tucked into his belt digging into his hip. Notebook 13, Gloom Fong Analysis. The pages were filled with his spidery, precise handwriting. Subject, Gloom Fong Type 4 Scuttler. Anatomy, quadrupedal, likely canine base. Elongated limbs suggest adaptation for navigating rubble. Auditory senses are primary. Eyes are vestigial, relies on echolocation clicks and scent. Weaknesses. High-frequency sound above 15 kHz causes disorientation. Joints at the primary knee are inverted and lack reinforcement. A targeted strike there can cripple. Behavioral note, patient. Will often observe from a distance, mapping sound signatures before attacking. Do not assume you are safe just because it hasn't charged. This one was a Type 4. Just as his notes predicted for this sector. It was methodically sweeping the street, its head twitching, the clicks growing more rapid. It was hunting. Izuku remained a statue, a piece of the rubble. He tracked its path, his mind a flurry of calculations. Wind speed, negligible. Distance to Might Mart entrance, 50 meters. Gloomfang's current position, 70 meters and closing. It was between him and his goal. He could wait. Patience was the currency of the living. But the filters for the sanctuary's water purifier were failing, and his last scouting run had confirmed the Might Mart's basement likely held industrial-grade replacements. Waiting wasn't a luxury they could afford for long. Slowly, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, he reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, palm-sized device he'd built himself. It was a simple clockwork timer attached to a metal plate and a shard of glass. A noisemaker. He wound the tiny dial, the soft clicks masked by the distant groan of straining metal, a constant symphony in the wreckage. He set it for 2 minutes. He judged the angle, the distance. His arm, though thin, was wiry and strong. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the device sailing in a high arc. It landed with a soft thump behind a pile of debris 200 meters down the street, in the opposite direction. Izuku didn't move. He counted the seconds in his head, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The Gloomfang stopped, its head swiveling, its clicks becoming sharp and focused. It had heard the landing. It remained still, waiting for a follow-up sound. 117, 118. The timer clicked over. The mechanism whirred, and the metal plate began to vibrate, scraping the shard of glass against the concrete in a high-pitched, rhythmic squeal. Scree, scree, scree. The Gloomfang reacted instantly. It let out a guttural shriek and launched itself towards the sound, its unnatural limbs devouring the distance with terrifying speed. It was a blur of pale flesh and clicking claws, a nightmare given form. That was his window. Izuku slid backward off the overpass, his worn boots finding purchase on the rusted rebar jutting from the broken concrete. He moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, a ghost in the urban graveyard. He didn't run. Running was loud, running was for the dying. He moved in a low crouch, his path pre-planned, his steps falling on solid ground he mapped weeks ago. He kept the bulk of a collapsed building between him and the creature, his ears straining to track the sounds of its rampage as it tore apart the debris pile where the noisemaker had landed. He reached the entrance to the Might Mart, a gaping maw of shattered glass and twisted metal. He slipped inside, the air growing colder, thick with the smell of decay and ancient, sugary rot. His hand went to the small, crank-powered flashlight on his hip, but he didn't turn it on. Light was a beacon for the things that hunted in the dark. Instead, he trusted his memory and the faint, ambient twilight filtering through the grime-caked skylights. The path to the basement was treacherous, blocked by toppled shelving and spilled, unidentifiable sludge. He navigated it with the familiarity of an animal in its den. This was his world, a world of angles, shadows, and calculated risks. The basement door was heavy steel, miraculously still on its hinges. He brought a small pry bar, and with a series of muffled, controlled grunts, he forced it open just enough to slip through, sealing it behind him. Down here, the darkness was absolute. Now, he thought. He pulled out the flashlight and gave the crank a few quick, quiet turns. A beam of pale, flickering light cut through the oppressive black. The storeroom was a time capsule. Crates of canned food, boxes of cleaning supplies, and against the far wall, exactly what he was looking for, a pallet of commercial-grade water filtration units. They were old, but the packaging was sealed. They would work. A genuine, unrestrained smile briefly touched his lips. It felt foreign, a rusty hinge forced to move. This was more than just a successful run. This was 2 more months of clean water. This was life. He worked quickly, strapping 2 of the heavy filter units to his reinforced pack frame. He also grabbed several cans of peaches, a rare delicacy, and a box of high-protein ration bars. The weight was significant, but manageable. The journey back would be slower, more dangerous. As he worked, his mind was already updating his notebook. Might Mart, Sector Gamma 7. Storeroom secure. Stock 18 water filters, EST, 40 cases canned goods, miscellaneous supplies. Route security. Compromised by single Type 4 Gloomfang. Re-entry requires new diversion tactic. His analysis wasn't for a hobby. It wasn't for fun. It was a weapon, the only one a quirkless boy could wield in a world that had forgotten heroes and valued only strength. The journey back to the sanctuary was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl. The added weight made silence a challenge. Every scrape of the pack, every dislodged pebble, was a potential death sentence. He took the low roads, the winding maintenance tunnels beneath the city's corpse, a route he had personally mapped and cleared over the past year. After what felt like an eternity, he arrived at a seemingly unremarkable wall of collapsed debris. But Izuku knew its secrets. He located a specific, rust-stained piece of rebar and pulled it 3 times in a distinct rhythm. A moment later, a section of the wall ground open with a low, hydraulic hiss, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. He slipped inside, and the door sealed behind him, plunging him into blessed, safe darkness. The air here was different. It was still stale and recycled, but it was warmer, tinged with the faint smell of cooking oil and human life. This was Sanctuary, a retrofitted subway station that housed the last 37 souls of their community. As he walked down the tunnel, low-wattage emergency lights flickered to life, guided by pressure plates he'd installed. They cast long, dancing shadows, but here they were comforting. He passed alcoves where families slept, curtained-off spaces that offered the thinnest illusion of privacy. He saw old man Tanaka, a former engineer, hunched over a sputtering generator, his face illuminated by the sparks from his tools. He saw little Emmy, a girl of 7, drawing on a piece of slate with a lump of chalk. She was drawing a giant, smiling yellow circle in the sky. He finally reached his own alcove, the one he shared with his mother. The space was tiny, dominated by a cot, a small fold-down desk, and shelves crammed with his notebooks. Inko Midoriya looked up from the small pot she was stirring over a single electric burner. Her face, so often etched with worry, softened into a relieved smile. She was thinner than she should be, her green hair threaded with gray, but her eyes held the same warmth he remembered from the pre-eclipse photos she sometimes showed him. Izuku, she breathed, rushing to him. She didn't hug him. The bulky pack made that impossible, but her hands fluttered over his arms, checking for injuries. You were gone so long. I'm fine, Mom, he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He shrugged out of the heavy pack and let it slide to the floor with a thud. And I was successful. He unstrapped one of the filters. Inko's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled up. In their world, this box of plastic and charcoal was more precious than gold. Oh, Izuku, how? Mart basement. Just like the schematic said. He pulled out the cans of peaches and placed them on their small table. And a treat. For a moment, the gloom of their existence lifted. Inko laughed, a real, genuine sound that echoed beautifully in the enclosed space. It was a sound rarer and more valuable than anything he could ever scavenge. He allowed himself another small smile, feeling the chronic tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. This was why he did it. Not for glory, not to be a hero. For this, for the quiet moments of peace, for the taste of peaches, for his mother's laughter. They ate their meager dinner of reconstituted vegetable protein, but tonight it felt like a feast. Inko talked about her day, mending clothes for the other families, helping ration out the food supplies. It was a small life, a fragile one, but it was theirs. You need to be more careful, she said, her tone shifting back to its familiar, worried default. Every time you go out there, that pack is so heavy. You're still just a boy. I'm 16, Mom. And I'm the only one who can do it, he replied, his voice flat with undeniable truth. He was the best scout, the best strategist. His quirklessness, once a source of shame and pity in a world of wonders, was now an asset. It forced him to be smarter, quieter, more observant than anyone who could rely on a flashy power. I have my notebooks. I'm always careful. His mother looked at the shelf of worn, leather-bound books. They were his life's work. Survival analysis for the quirkless, maps of every sector, patrol routes of the scavenger gangs, anatomical drawings of every Gloomfang variant he'd encountered, guides to edible fungi, schematics for traps. They were the reason they were all still alive. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. I know. I'm just proud. And terrified. It's a terrible combination for a mother. Before he could reply, a low, deep thrum vibrated through the concrete floor. It was unnatural, rhythmic. Not the groan of shifting rubble, or the distant tremors of the shattered earth. This was manufactured. Izuku was on his feet in an instant, his brief moment of peace shattered. He grabbed his flashlight and sprinted from the alcove, his mother's worried cry echoing behind him. He wasn't the only one. Others were emerging from their spaces, their faces pale with fear. Old man Tanaka was already at the main communications panel, a mess of wires and salvaged monitors near the station's main platform. What is it? Izuku asked, his voice sharp. I don't know, Tanaka grunted, his fingers flying over a keyboard. The northern perimeter sensors just went dead. All of them. Not tripped. Just silent. Silence was worse than an alarm. It meant a deliberate, professional breach. The thrumming grew louder, a deep bass note that seemed to resonate in their very bones. Then it stopped. For a full 10 seconds, an unnatural, oppressive quiet fell over the station, deeper than the usual silence of the wreckage. It was a void of sound, a vacuum. Izuku's blood ran cold. He knew of only one quirk that could do that. His thought was confirmed a moment later when the main blast door at the end of the tunnel, a 10-ton slab of reinforced steel, screamed in protest. A high-frequency shriek pierced the air, and the metal of the door began to glow cherry red in a perfect, circular pattern. Then, with a concussive boom that threw them all off their feet, the circle of metal blew inward, crashing onto the subway platform with the force of a bomb. Framed in the smoking, perfectly circular hole stood a man. He was tall and wiry, clad in scavenged leather and tactical gear adorned with salvaged audio equipment, speakers on his shoulders, wires coiling around his arms like metallic snakes. A rebreather mask covered the lower half of his face, its filters pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. Knock, knock, the man's voice boomed, amplified by his gear. It was a smooth, resonant baritone that oozed condescension. This was Feedback, leader of the Jackals, the most vicious scavenger gang in the sector. His quirk, Sonic Dominion, gave him absolute control over sound vibrations. Behind him, a dozen of his gang members poured through the hole, armed with crude melee weapons and scavenged firearms. They fanned out, their expressions a mixture of cruel glee and predatory hunger. The survivors of Sanctuary huddled together, a flock of sheep cornered by wolves. Feedback strolled onto the platform as if he owned it, his heavy boots echoing with deliberate force. He surveyed the terrified faces, the meager living spaces, the sputtering generator. A low, amused chuckle vibrated from his mask. Well, well. Look at this. A whole colony of little rats, hiding in the walls, he said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was somehow more menacing. Cozy. I'm impressed you managed to keep this place hidden for so long. But nothing stays hidden from me. I hear everything. He raised a hand, and the low, oppressive silence fell again. The panicked whimpers of the children, the frantic whispers of the adults, all of it was instantly snuffed out. The only thing they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts, and the amplified sound of Feedback's footsteps. Izuku pushed himself to his feet, his mind racing. He mentally catalogued the Jackals. 12 of them, plus Feedback. They were well armed. Sanctuary's defenders consisted of a handful of adults with makeshift weapons. They had no combat-effective quirks. Tanaka could manipulate magnetic fields, but only for small objects. One of the women could make small plants grow faster. Useless. They were utterly, hopelessly outmatched. Feedback clapped his hands, and the sound returned with a painful rush. Now, I'm a reasonable man, he declared, spreading his arms wide. I appreciate hard work, and you've all worked very hard, stocking up this little pantry of yours. His gaze swept over their supply crates, lingering on the water purifier. So I'm going to make you an offer. You're going to pack up everything. Every can of food, every drop of clean water, every battery, every scrap of medicine. You'll load it onto our transport. In return, I'll let you live. A wave of despair washed over the community. That was everything. Their entire stockpile. Without it, they wouldn't last a month. It was a death sentence, just a slower one. One of the men, a former security guard named Kenji, stepped forward, his fists clenched. You can't do that. We have children here. We'll starve. Feedback simply tilted his head. He didn't even look at Kenji. He just snapped his fingers. A focused, invisible lance of sonic energy shot from his hand and struck the wall next to Kenji's head. The concrete exploded inward, showering the man with razor-sharp shrapnel. Kenji screamed and fell back, clutching his bleeding face. I can do whatever I want, Feedback said, his voice dangerously calm. I am the one with the power to tear this entire place down around your ears. You have nothing. You are nothing. He let that sink in, savoring their terror. You have 24 hours. My men and I will be back this time tomorrow. If the welcome wagon isn't loaded and waiting for us, we will turn this cozy little rat's nest into a tomb. He turned to leave, his point made. His men started to pull back, laughing and jeering at the weeping survivors. But then, His eyes fell on Izuku. Perhaps it was because Izuku wasn't crying. He wasn't pleading. He was just standing there, his green eyes narrowed, his expression an unreadable mask of intense concentration. He was observing, analyzing. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was calculation. Feedback paused, intrigued. You. The quiet one. What's your name, kid? Izuku's mouth was dry. He could feel his mother's hand gripping his arm, trying to pull him back. He ignored it. He met the villain's gaze. Izuku. Izuku, feedback repeated, tasting the name. You look like a smart kid. Smarter than the rest of these pathetic sheep. So let me give you a piece of advice, Izuku. Don't try to be a hero. There are no heroes anymore. There's only the loud, and the dead. With a final, booming laugh, he turned and disappeared through the hole in the door, his gang following him out into the oppressive twilight of the iron wreckage. The moment they were gone, the dam of composure broke. The sanctuary erupted into a cacophony of grief and terror. Kenji was groaning in pain as Inko and another woman tried to tend to his wounds. People were shouting, accusing, sobbing. The fragile peace of their community had been irrevocably shattered. We have to give it to them. One woman cried. It's the only way. And then what? Another man shot back. We die in a month instead of tomorrow? What's the difference? We could run. Run where? To be eaten by Gloom Fong or picked off by another gang? This is the only safe place we have. The arguments devolved into hopeless, terrified noise. The weight of their doom settled over them like a physical shroud. They were trapped. There was no way out. Izuku stood amidst the chaos, silent. He saw little Emmy, the girl who drew pictures of the sun, burying her face in her mother's side, her small body shaking with sobs. He saw old man Tanaka, his face ashen, staring at the destroyed blast door, the one piece of security he had been so proud of. He saw his own mother, her face a mask of utter despair, not for herself, but for him. He felt the familiar cold dread creeping into his stomach. Feedback was right. They had nothing. No power, no weapons, no hope. They were cornered rats, waiting for the exterminator. The logic was inescapable. The data was clear. Surrender meant a slow death. Resistance meant a quick one. He looked at the faces of his community, at the 36 people who depended on his scavenging, on his intellect, on the ink-filled pages of his notebooks. He thought of the taste of peaches and the sound of his mother's laughter. The despair in his gut hardened. It compressed, transforming from a cold, numbing dread into a white-hot point of pure, unadulterated fury. He turned away from the chaos, his movements stiff and deliberate. He walked back to his alcove, the shouts and sobs of his community fading into a dull roar in his ears. He sat down at his small, fold-out desk. The surface was cluttered with scavenged tools, half-finished schematics, and spent ink cartridges. He reached up to a high shelf, his hand bypassing the 13 worn, bulging notebooks filled with the knowledge that had kept them alive until now. His fingers closed around the smooth, unblemished leather of a new one. It was the last of a pack of 5 he had found in a ruined office supply store years ago. He had been saving it. He placed the notebook on the desk. It was pristine, its pages clean, its potential limitless. It was a stark, defiant white against the grime and gloom of his world. The sound of his pen uncapping was a sharp, distinct click in the cacophony of despair. It cut through the noise, a tiny sound of purpose in a sea of hopelessness. He opened the book to the first page. The paper was smooth and cool beneath his hand. He smoothed it down, his expression hardening into one of grim, terrifying resolve. He was afraid. He was terrified beyond measure. But his fear was now a fuel, a lens that brought the problem into sharp, perfect focus. Feedback's words echoed in his mind. There's only the loud, and the dead. You're wrong, Izuku thought, his knuckles white as he gripped the pen. You've forgotten the third option. The quiet. He bent over the page, the low-wattage light casting his shadow long against the wall. He began to write. The title, sprawled across the top of the page in his neat, analytical script, was not a plan of attack, nor a plan of surrender. It was a declaration. Notebook 14, a symphony of silence. The aftermath of Feedback's departure was a gaping wound in the heart of the sanctuary. The air, once filled with a fragile, domestic hum, was now thick with the poisonous static of despair. People huddled in small, whispering clumps, their faces pale and drawn in the low, flickering light. Sobs echoed from curtained-off alcoves, a miserable, disjointed chorus of hopelessness. Kenji sat with his head in his hands, his face patched with strips of clean cloth, a living testament to the villain's casual cruelty. The circular, gaping hole in the blast door was a mocking eye, a constant, silent reminder of their violation and their impending doom. Amidst it all, Izuku sat at his desk, the only point of stillness in a swirling vortex of fear. The clean, white page of his new notebook was a stark anomaly in the grimy, makeshift world. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't grieving. The time for that would come later, or perhaps never. Right now, every ounce of his being, every synapse in his brain, was firing with a cold, desperate clarity. He was a machine processing an impossible equation, and failure was not an acceptable outcome. His pen moved with a feverish intensity, scratching across the paper. It was not the smooth, contemplative script of his usual analysis. This was sharp, angular, urgent. He drew maps, not of the wreckage as it was, but as he needed it to become. A stage. He sketched diagrams of traps, not with the intent to kill, but to herd, to manipulate. He wrote down timings, acoustic calculations, and behavioral predictions based on his scant observations of feedback and his gang. He was not designing a defense. He was composing a piece of music, and its instruments would be silence, chaos, and fear. "What are you doing?" The voice, rough with pain and anger, cut through his concentration. Izuku looked up. It was Kenji, his one eye not covered by bandages glaring with a mixture of suspicion and fury. Old man Tanaka stood behind him, his expression grim, his hands stained with grease from a futile attempt to access the blast door. A small crowd had gathered, their despair momentarily forgotten, their attention now fixed on the boy scribbling in his book as if the world wasn't ending around them. "You're just writing?" Kenji spat, gesturing vaguely at the notebook. "They're coming back to kill us all, and you're drawing in your diary?" Izuku's gaze was flat, devoid of the defensiveness Kenji expected. "I'm working," he stated simply. "Working on what?" Tanaka interjected, his voice weary. "Son, there's no work to be done. The door is slag. Our defenses are a joke. He can do what he did from 100 meters away. We have no way to fight him." "That's because you're thinking about fighting," Izuku said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving intensity that made them all pause. He stood up, taking his notebook with him. "Fighting is loud. Fighting is what he wants. We are not going to fight. We are going to orchestrate." He walked past them, towards the center of the main platform. He placed his notebook on a large, flat crate that served as a communal table, opening it to a master schematic of the surrounding 3-block radius. His confidence, so alien in this atmosphere of defeat, drew the others closer like moths to a strange, cold flame. "Gather everyone who can work," Izuku commanded, his voice gaining a new, unfamiliar authority. "Tanaka, I need you. Kenji, if you can still see straight, I need your strength. Anya, Ren, you too. We have less than 24 hours. Anya, a lithe and quick-footed scout, and Ren, a broad-shouldered man who handled most of the heavy lifting, exchanged uncertain glances but shuffled forward. Inko Midoriya appeared at the edge of the small crowd, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of pride and fear for her son. When the small, able-bodied contingent of the community was assembled, Izuku began. He wasn't the boy who stammered, the quiet scavenger who avoided eye contact. He was someone else entirely. He was the analyst, the strategist, the commander. Feedback's greatest strength is his quirk, Izuku began, tapping a diagram of the villain he'd sketched from memory. He controls sound. But that is also his identity. He's arrogant. He's loud. His gang emulates him. They use noise to intimidate, to sow fear. They announce their presence because they believe no one can stand against them. That arrogance is his weakness. It's the weakness we are going to exploit. He pointed to the map. We are not defending the sanctuary. The sanctuary is the bait. The real battleground is out here. His finger traced a winding, deliberate path through the ruins. We are going to turn the iron wreckage, his own hunting ground, against him. He flipped the page. Phase 1, the stage. We need to create an acoustic environment. Tanaka, I need you and your team to salvage every piece of sound-dampening material you can find. Old mattresses from the hab blocks, insulation foam from the industrial sector, heavy carpets, anything. We are going to line this specific corridor. He traced a narrow alleyway on the map, and turn it into an anechoic chamber. A zone of silence. Tanaka stroked his chin, his engineer's mind catching on. To mask our movements? To mask our presence entirely, Izuku corrected. When they enter that zone, their own senses will betray them. They'll be deafened by the lack of echo, disoriented. It will be the first note of our symphony. He flipped the page again. Phase 2, the instruments. Ren, Kenji, I need you to lead teams to rig pitfalls. Not kill traps. Just deep enough to incapacitate and, more importantly, to separate them. We will cover them with debris. We'll also rig clatter traps, piles of scrap metal, sheets of corrugated steel, anything that will make an unholy amount of noise when tripped. But these aren't for them. Anya frowned. Then who are they for? For the Gloom Fong, Izuku said, his eyes glinting. We are going to invite new players to the game. Feedback's gang patrols this area. They know the Gloom Fong nests. We are going to place these noisemakers on the fringes of their territory. When the jackals trip them, the sound will act as a dinner bell, drawing the creatures in from the perimeter and boxing them in. A murmur of horrified understanding went through the small group. He was planning to use the monsters of the wreckage as a weapon. It was brilliant, and utterly insane. And finally Izuku said, his voice dropping lower, Phase 3, the crescendo. He pointed to a massive, skeletal skyscraper on his map, the Dauntless Tower, which loomed over the entire sector. Its lower floors were a chaotic jumble of collapsed beams and concrete slabs. Tanaka, this is the most critical part. Your magnetic quirk. Is it strong enough to dislodge triggered bolts? Tanaka's eyes widened. Triggered bolts? You mean like explosive construction bolts? Perhaps, if the mechanism is simple enough. It would take all my concentration. But why? Because Feedback's final move, when he's frustrated and angry, will be to hit us with everything he has, Izuku explained, his gaze unwavering. He will target the entrance to this sanctuary with a full-power sonic blast to bury us alive. I'm counting on it. We are going to pre-weaken the support structures of the Dauntless Tower's overhang, right above the main approach. We will rig them with a simple, magnetically triggered release mechanism. When he unleashes his final attack, the sound and vibration will be the perfect cover. Tanaka, you will give the signal, and we will bring 100 tons of steel and concrete down, not on him, but around him. We will build him a cage. Silence. The sheer, audacious madness of the plan hung in the air. It was a multi-layered, high-risk gambit where a single mistimed element would result in all of their deaths. Kenji was the first to break. You're insane, he breathed, shaking his head. This is a suicide mission. What if they don't follow the path? What if the Gloom Fong attack us instead? What if his blast brings the tower down on us? They will follow the path because it will be the clearest route. It will look like the path of least resistance, Izuku countered, his voice sharp and certain. The Gloom Fong won't attack us because we will be utterly silent, hidden in the zone of silence while the jackals are making a racket. And the collapse will be controlled. I've studied the building's schematics. The debris will fall outward, into the street. It will work. He looked at each of them, his gaze piercing. This is not a plan based on hope. It is a plan based on analysis. On his psychology. On the physics of our environment. It is our only chance. The alternative is to hand them everything we have and then wait to starve. Or we can fight back on our own terms, without throwing a single punch. His words, stripped of all emotion and presented as pure, cold logic, were more convincing than any passionate speech could have been. He wasn't offering them hope. He was offering them a mathematical possibility of survival. Old man Tanaka looked from the schematic to Izuku's determined face. He saw the intricate details, the calculated risks, the sheer intellectual force behind it all. He let out a long, slow breath. The boy is right, he said, his voice raspy but firm. It's a clockwork mechanism of death. And we're the ones winding it. I'm in. One by one, the others nodded. Kenji, his visible eye filled with a new, grudging respect, clenched his fist. Show me where you want the first pit. The sanctuary, a place of despair only minutes before, was transformed into a silent, focused hive of activity. The next 20 hours were a blur of tense, whispered coordination. Izuku was the nerve center, a ghost flitting between teams, ensuring every piece of his symphony was being set perfectly in place. He led the first team himself into the designated alleyway. They moved like wraiths, hauling rotting mattresses and scavenged acoustic foam. They worked under the oppressive, violet-gray sky, every distant groan of metal making their hearts leap into their throats. Izuku didn't just erect, he worked, his thin frame straining as he helped hoist a massive slab of industrial insulation into place, his hands raw and bleeding by the end of it. When they were finished, the alley was an eerie, unsettling tunnel. Stepping inside felt like being submerged in water. Sound died the moment it left your lips. Meanwhile, Tanaka, with his knowledge of engineering, oversaw the most dangerous task. He and Rin took a small team to the base of the dauntless tower. Working with muffled tools and hand signals, they began drilling into the critical support beams of the overhang, weakening them just enough. They placed the magnetic triggers, complex mechanisms Tanaka had fashioned from salvaged servomotors and powerful electromagnets. He handled the final wiring himself, his old, steady hands moving with the surgeon's precision. One mistake, one loud noise, and their tomb would be completed ahead of schedule. Anya and Kenji led the other teams, their missions equally perilous. They moved along the path Izuku had mapped, digging pits with muffled shovels and camouflaging them with scraps of metal and layers of dust. Further out, Anya used her agility to scale ruined buildings and place the noisemakers, each one a carefully constructed device set to trigger with a tripwire, designed to create a specific cacophony, clanging pipes, shattering glass, a high-pitched metallic shriek. They were planting the seeds of chaos. Back in the sanctuary, Inko led the non-combatants. They were not idle. They prepared rudimentary medical supplies, bandages torn from old sheets, sterilized needles. They filled every spare container with water and stockpiled the most portable food. They were preparing for two possibilities, a swift relocation if the plan worked, or a grim, final stand if it failed. Every time the door to the sanctuary hissed open to admit a returning work party, every face turned, their hearts pounding in shared anxiety. Izuku took no rest. He moved on pure adrenaline and cold resolve. He checked Tanaka's rigging, inspected Kenji's pitfalls, and confirmed the placement of Anya's noisemakers on his map. He was everywhere, his mind holding every single moving piece of the plan in a delicate, terrifying balance. His mother cornered him during one of his brief returns to the sanctuary to grab more wire. Izuku, she whispered, her hands gripping his dusty, grime-covered arms. Her eyes were frantic with fear. This is too much. You're just a child. There are no children anymore, Mom, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. He looked into her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the commander vanished, and she saw her son, the scared, determined boy who was carrying the weight of 36 lives on his shoulders. I have to do this. It's the only way. He gave her hand a quick squeeze before pulling away, the commander's mask snapping back into place. Keep everyone away from the entrance. No matter what you hear. No matter what happens. As the 24th hour approached, everything was in place. The stage was set. The instruments were tuned. The community was hidden away deep in the sanctuary, a silent, terrified audience. Izuku, Tanaka, and Anya took up their position in their command posts, a shattered office on the third floor of a building overlooking the entire approach, its windows draped with heavy black cloth, leaving only a tiny slit for observation. Izuku had a pair of binoculars. Tanaka had a small, trigger device wired to a powerful battery, which in turn was connected to the magnetic bolts. Anya was their lookout, her sharp eyes scanning the ruins. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the wreckage pressed in on them, every second stretching into an eternity. Doubt began to creep into the edges of Izuku's meticulously constructed plan. What if he was wrong? What if feedback had decided to simply level the area from a distance? What if his analysis of the man's ego was just a projection of his own desperate need for a weakness to exist? And then they heard it. It started as a low thrum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, the signature thrum of Feedback's quirk, announcing his approach. A fleet of ramshackle buggies and trucks roared into view, their engines deliberately unmuffled, their headlights cutting uselessly through the permanent twilight. The jackals had returned. "They're here," Anya whispered, her voice tight. Izuku raised his binoculars. Feedback was in the lead vehicle, standing in the back, his arms crossed, a king surveying his domain. He looked even more confident than before. He had come to collect his tribute. The convoy rolled to a stop 100 meters from the sanctuary's hidden entrance. Feedback and his gang dismounted, their laughter and crude jokes echoing through the ruins. There were 15 of them this time, 3 more than before. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained impassive. The numbers didn't matter if the mechanism worked. "Rat folk!" Feedback's amplified voice boomed, powerful enough to send dust shivering from the ceiling of their hideout. "Your time is up. Bring out my supplies, and I might be convinced not to turn your little hole into a gravel pit for fun." Silence was his only answer. Feedback waited a moment, a frown creasing his brow. "Playing deaf? I can fix that." He gestured, and 2 of his men stepped forward with a heavy battering ram. They began to march towards the main debris field hiding the entrance. They were taking the direct route, the path Izuku had so carefully left open for them. "They're on the path," Izuku breathed, his knuckles white around the binoculars. Phase 1 is a go. The 2 men with the ram were the first to enter the area of Izuku's traps. They passed the tripwire. Izuku had designed this one to be subtle. A small, almost inaudible click, and 100 meters to their left, a pulley system released a sheet of metal, which slid down a slanted roof and crashed onto a pile of glass bottles below. Crash! Tinkle! The sudden, sharp noise made the entire gang jump. 2 of the jackals instinctively spun and fired their rifles in that direction, the gunshots a deafening roar in the quiet. "Idiots! Hold your fire!" Feedback snarled. "It's probably just a gloom fawn. Ignore it." But the seed of unease had been planted. And the gunshots, so much louder than Izuku's trap, had been a far more effective dinner bell. The next group of jackals, moving more cautiously now, continued forward. Another tripwire. This time, a series of heavy chains hoisted into the air were released, clattering down a metal fire escape with a sound like a monstrous skeleton falling apart. Clang 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 clatter. More gunfire. More curses from Feedback, whose arrogance was beginning to curdle into irritation. "Spread out. Find the source of the noise. I want this area clear," he roared. This was the moment Izuku had planned for. By spreading out, they blundered straight into the rest of his symphony. A heavy thug on the right flank vanished with a startled yell as the ground gave way beneath him. A pitfall. 2 more, rushing to his aid, stumbled into another. From the left, a piercing shriek echoed as another jackal triggered a noisemaker Anya had placed near a known gloomfang nest. And then, the new players arrived. From the deep shadows of a collapsed underpass, the first gloomfang emerged. It was a Type 4 scuttler, drawn by the cacophony. It shrieked and launched itself at the nearest jackal, its maw splitting open. The man screamed, a wet, choke sound that was cut off abruptly. Chaos erupted. More gloomfang, drawn by the sounds of battle, began to scuttle out of the ruins. The jackals, who had come expecting a simple collection, were suddenly locked in a desperate fight for their lives against the apex predators of the wreckage. Their panicked shouts and the roar of their guns only served to attract more of the creatures. Through his binoculars, Izuku watched, his face a grim mask. The symphony was playing itself now. The jackals were both the musicians and the audience. Feedback was enraged. His plan was falling apart. His men were being torn to pieces. He let out a furious roar, and for the first time, he truly unleashed his quirk. He sent out a massive, 360-degree sonic pulse, a wave of pure force that shattered windows for blocks around and sent a pack of attacking gloomfangs screeching back, their sensitive ears overloaded. "Enough!" he bellowed, his amplified voice shaking the very foundations of the buildings. "You think you can trick me? You think you can hide from me? I'll bring this whole damn sector down on your heads." He turned his full attention to the sanctuary. His men were forgotten. The Gloomfang were forgotten. His pride had been wounded, and he was going to erase the source of his humiliation. This was it, the crescendo. He's going for it, Izuku said, his voice deadly calm. Tanaka. Get ready. The old engineer nodded, his hand hovering over the trigger. His face was beaded with sweat, his entire body trembling with the strain of his focus. Feedback planted his feet, leaning forward as if into a gale. The air around him began to shimmer and distort. A low hum escalated into a deafening, world-ending whine. Izuku didn't need his notebook to know what was coming. The villain was gathering all his power for a single, focused, devastating attack. Now you rats! Feedback screamed, thrusting his hands forward. Die! A lance of pure sonic energy, visible as a ripple in the air, shot from his hands and slammed into the debris field in front of the sanctuary entrance. The initial impact vaporized concrete and twisted steel. The ground bucked, and the sound was so immense, so total, that it felt like the universe was being torn apart. Inside their hideout, the three of them were thrown against the back wall. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling. But Izuku's eyes were fixed on the scene outside. This was the cover he needed. Tanaka! Now! He screamed over the din. Tanaka, groaning with effort, slammed his thumb down on the trigger. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a series of muffled, percussive thumps that were completely swallowed by Feedback's ongoing sonic assault, the explosive bolts on the dauntless tower fired. The massive overhang, a multi-ton slab of concrete and steel, groaned. It held for a moment, then began to peel away from the building's face in horrifying slow motion. Feedback, still pouring his power into his attack, was oblivious. The first sign he had that something was wrong was when a shadow fell over him. He looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. The sky was falling. It didn't fall on him. Just as Izuku's schematics had predicted, the structure's weight and pre-weakened joints caused it to shear off and collapse outward. 100 tons of rubble came down in an apocalyptic avalanche, crashing into the street directly in front of and around Feedback. The ground shook with the force of a localized earthquake. The villain was not crushed, but he was completely and utterly entombed. A cage of his own making. The sonic blast died with his scream of terror. The silence that followed was more profound than anything they had ever experienced. It was a heavy, ringing void, broken only by the distant, triumphant shrieks of the Gloomfang as they fell upon the remaining, terrified jackals. The dust began to settle, revealing a transformed landscape. Where there was once a street, there was now a mountain of debris, with Feedback's prison at its heart. It was over. Slowly, shakily, the survivors of Sanctuary emerged from their hiding place. They stared at the devastation, at the mountain of rubble, their faces a mixture of terror, shock, and dawning, unbelievable relief. They had survived. They had won. Kenji was the first to approach the command post. He looked up at the shattered window where Izuku was now standing, his face streaked with grime, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He didn't say a word. He just raised a hand and gave a slow, solemn nod of respect. Izuku looked out over the scene of his victory. He saw the bodies of the jackals, the feasting Gloomfang, the mountain of rubble that was once a skyscraper. He had saved them. But this was not the clean, bloodless victory of the heroes in the old stories. This was brutal and terrifying. He had turned the world's horrors against his enemies. He had conducted a symphony of death. The relief he felt was hollow, quickly replaced by a heavy, chilling certainty. This victory was temporary. Hiding in their hole, lashing out with clever traps when cornered, it wasn't a sustainable way to live. Another Feedback would come, or a threat that couldn't be outsmarted. He was their leader now. He could see it in the way they looked at him, in the mixture of awe and fear in their eyes. The quiet scavenger boy was gone, buried under the weight of this night. In his place was a commander, a strategist, a weapon. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his work was just beginning. The symphony was over, but the war for the dawn had just begun. Victory was not a celebration. It was a chore. The days following the symphony of silence were grim, spent clearing rubble, tending to the wounded, and counting the dead. Not their dead, the jackals. Their bodies, torn apart by Gloomfang, were a grisly testament to Izuku's strategy. He had ordered them dragged out and burned, the acrid smoke a constant, nauseating reminder of the cost of their survival. The mountain of debris that entombed feedback loomed over their home like a monolithic tombstone, a monument to a battle won not with courage, but with cold, brutal calculation. The atmosphere in the sanctuary had shifted. The raw, panicked terror was gone, replaced by something heavier, a sober, fearful respect, all of it directed at him. When he walked through the main cavern, conversations would hush. People would avert their eyes, not with scorn, but with a kind of awe that felt suffocating. They no longer saw the quiet, analytical boy who brought back scavenged treasures. They saw the architect of their impossible victory. They saw a commander. They saw a weapon. Izuku felt the change like a physical weight on his shoulders. He hadn't slept in 3 days, his mind a relentless churn of variables and future threats. The Symphony of Silence was a brilliant, one-time trick. It had relied on surprise, on feedback's specific arrogance, on a very particular set of environmental circumstances. It was not a strategy, it was a gambit. What would happen when the next threat came? One that was quieter, more cautious? One that didn't rely on a quirk he could so easily counter? Hiding was no longer an option. Their victory had been loud. Word would spread through the scavenger networks. Their little sanctuary was no longer a secret. It was a prize, a challenge. They had painted a target on their own backs. He found himself in the makeshift workshop with old man Tanaka. The engineer was meticulously cataloging salvaged components from the jackal's wrecked vehicles. His hands, usually steady, still trembled slightly. "We were lucky," Tanaka said without looking up, his voice a low rumble. A breath of wind in the wrong direction, a miscalculation of a single second, and that tombstone out there would be our own. "Luck is not a sustainable resource," Izuku replied, his voice flat. He ran a hand over a salvaged radio transceiver. "We need a permanent solution. A better defense. A way to project strength, not just hide from its absence." Tanaka finally stopped his work, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He looked at Izuku, his old eyes filled with a weary wisdom. "You're thinking like a leader, boy. It's a heavy burden. Strength, in this world, it comes from overwhelming power. A quirk that can level a city block. A private army. We have neither. Then we need knowledge," Izuku countered, his voice hardening with conviction. "There has to be another way. There were people who knew how to fight threats like this. People who did it every day. The heroes." Tanaka let out a short, bitter laugh. "Heroes are dust in stories, Izuku. They died with the sun. Their knowledge didn't," Izuku insisted. He gestured to the transceiver. "You salvaged this. You pulled data from old hard drives, schematics from forgotten servers. There has to be something left. A contingency plan. A weapon. A person." The old man grew quiet, his gaze distant. He seemed to age a decade in a single moment. There were whispers. In the first few years after the eclipse, before everything completely fell apart, stories of holdouts. Last stands? He turned and rummaged through a battered metal footlocker, pulling out a palm-sized data slate, its screen cracked but functional. He swiped it on, the device whirring to life with a faint blue glow. "I salvaged this from the wreck of a military drone a few years back," he explained, tapping the screen. Most of the data was corrupted, but one file was partially intact. A final mission log. He handed the slate to Izuku. The text was fragmented, filled with static and errors, but a few phrases stood out. "Approaching designated target. All Might Memorial Zone. Epicenter of the anomaly. Unstable reality. Primary objective. Make contact with Guardian. Last confirmed heroic class asset. Tashinori Yagi. Final bastion against the dark. God help us all." The log ended there. Izuku read the words over and over, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Tashinori Yagi. All Might. The symbol of peace. The man who had defeated the villain responsible for the eclipse, but not before the world was broken. He was a figure of myth, a ghost from a brighter age. And this log suggested he had survived, a guardian at the epicenter of the cataclysm. The All Might Memorial Zone, Izuku breathed, the name tasting like ash and legend. That's the Deadlands. No one goes there. They say the air itself is wrong. That the gloom fong there are different. They say it's the grave of our world, Tanaka agreed grimly. A 50-mile wasteland of twisted physics and monsters born from the eclipse itself. This drone never reported back. But if what this log says is true, if he, or even just his knowledge, survived in that place, it would be the greatest weapon we could ever hope to find. The decision solidified in Izuku's mind with the force of a physical impact. This was the answer. This was the path forward. He couldn't build a future for his people on traps and tricks. He needed the foundation of the past. He needed the wisdom of the last hero. I'm going, he said. Tanaka's head snapped up. Don't be a fool, boy. That's not a scavenger run. It's a suicide mission. I showed you this as a curiosity, a piece of history, not a treasure map. It is a treasure map, Izuku said, his green eyes burning with a feverish light. The treasure is a chance. A real one. The argument that followed was brief and futile. Izuku's logic was, as always, unassailable. He would go alone. He was the quietest, the most skilled at evasion. Taking a team would only increase their chances of detection and risk lives they couldn't afford to lose. He would take minimal supplies, enough for a 3-day round trip. He would travel light and fast. The hardest part was telling his mother. He found her in their alcove, mending his torn jacket. The simple, domestic act was a painful contrast to the monumental, terrifying task he was about to undertake. He explained his plan, his voice low and steady, omitting the most dangerous details but laying out the core logic. Inko listened in silence, her needle stopping in mid-stitch. When he was finished, she didn't cry. She didn't plead. The terror was plain on her face, in the slight tremble of her hands, but her expression was one of profound, heartbreaking resignation. She had seen the commander he had become. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the quiet boy she had raised was now driven by a force she could not hope to contain. There was a time, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, when you wanted to be a hero like All Might. You would run around in that little blue onesie, a huge smile on your face. She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his. There is no smile on your face now, Izuku. Be careful. Please, just come back. He couldn't promise her he would. So instead, he simply nodded, pulled on his freshly mended jacket, and walked out into the gloom, the weight of his mother's fear a shroud around him. The journey to the Deadlands was a descent into hell. The further Izuku traveled from the relative familiarity of the iron wreckage, the more the world itself seemed to fray at the edges. The laws of physics grew suggestions rather than rules. Streets would end in sheer, glassy drops into nothingness. Buildings were twisted into impossible, Escher-like geometries. This was the lingering effect of the eclipse, the scar tissue of a reality-warping quirk. He moved with a hunter's grace, a ghost in a world of ghosts. His well-worn copy of Notebook 13, Gloomfang Analysis, was his Bible. He skirted the territories of larger packs, his senses tuned to the faintest click or scrape. He navigated by the skeletal remains of pre-eclipse landmarks, his internal compass unerring. On the second day, he encountered a new threat. While slipping through the skeletal husk of a ruined shopping mall, a high-pitched, chittering screech echoed from the cavernous ceiling above. He froze, melting into the shadow of a rusted-out escalator. He looked up. Hanging from the rafters like grotesque, leathery bats were creatures he had only ever read about in fragmented survivor accounts, shriekers. They were avian, or perhaps chiropteran, in origin, their bodies small and wiry, but their wingspans were immense, designed for silent gliding. Their heads were dominated by a massive, dish-like auditory sensor, and their mouths were needle-toothed maws that could emit a focused sonic cry powerful enough to liquefy organs. Notebook 13, page 54, Gloomfang, Type 7, Shrieker. Behavior, ambush predator. Hunts from above. Relies entirely on sound. Key weakness, cannot distinguish between ambient and targeted noise. Susceptible to wide-frequency acoustic decoys. Izuku didn't dare breathe. The colony was dormant, but one wrong step, one dislodged piece of debris, would trigger a vertical feeding frenzy. He needed to pass through this area. Going around would add half a day to his journey. Slowly, his movements measured in millimeters, He reached into his pouch and retrieved a small, circular device. A sonic disruptor, something he'd built from salvaged speakers and a frequency modulator. It was a one-use item. He set the timer for 30 seconds, gave the dial a twist to set it to a chaotic, multi-frequency broadcast, and with a gentle underhand toss, sent it skittering across the marble floor towards the far end of the mall. He immediately flattened himself into a drainage gutter, covering his ears. 30 seconds later, the device let out a deafening blast of white noise, a sound like 1,000 radios all tuned to static at once. The shrieker colony exploded into motion. Their piercing cries of agitation and confusion filled the air as they swarmed towards the source of the noise, their sonic attacks blasting chunks out of the floor where the disruptor lay. Under the cover of the chaos, Izuku scurried through the mall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of terror and triumph. He faced human threats as well. He spent 6 agonizing hours hidden in the hollowed-out chassis of a burned bus while a patrol from a gang known as the Rust Dogs passed through. They were savages, their bodies covered in ritualistic rust-stained tattoos, their laughter sharp and cruel as they tormented a captured wanderer before dragging him away. Izuku watched, his stomach churning, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. He did nothing. He was not a hero. He was a survivor on a mission. Intervention was a luxury he could not afford. His inaction tasted like bile in his throat. Finally, he reached the edge of the All Might Memorial Zone. The transition was stark. A shimmering, invisible line seemed to divide the wreckage from the deadlands. The air grew colder, and a perpetual, low hum vibrated through the soles of his boots. Here, the destruction was different. It wasn't collapsed, it was erased. Buildings were scooped out, leaving behind perfect, concave shells. The ground was pocked with craters that seemed to absorb the dim light. This was Ground Zero, and in the center of it all, visible for miles, was the memorial itself. A colossal bronze statue of All Might, erected in the hopeful days after he'd defeated the villain. It was broken. One arm, once raised in triumph, was snapped off at the elbow. The other was gone entirely. The iconic, smiling face was split down the middle by a massive fissure, giving it a grotesque, weeping expression. It was no longer a symbol of peace. It was a monument to failure. Izuku pressed on, his senses on high alert. The gloom fawn here were twisted, larger, and more aggressive. He saw things that defied his notebooks, abominations that were half flesh, half shadow. He evaded them all, his path a complex, silent dance through the ruins of a hero's legacy. He found the bunker by accident. He took shelter from an acid rain shower in the base of the broken statue, and noticed a pattern in the scorch marks on the floor. It was a phrase, written in English, almost completely faded. I am here. It was All Might's catchphrase. Following an instinct he couldn't explain, Izuku pushed against the scorched wall beneath the words. With a low groan of protesting metal, a section of the wall receded, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. He descended, his crank flashlight cutting a nervous path through the darkness. The air was stale, cold, and smelled of antiseptic and long-settled dust. The stairs opened into a small, circular room. It was a shrine. Display cases lined the walls, holding shattered relics, a single, scorched gauntlet with a stylized on it, a tattered, blood-stained cape, a cracked visor. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, flickering emergency light, was a chair, and in the chair sat a man, or what was left of a man. He was a scarecrow assembled from bone and regret. The iconic, muscular frame of All Might was gone, replaced by a skeletal thinness that was horrifying to behold. His skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over a cage of sharp, prominent bones. The signature blonde hair was thin and white, falling in greasy strands around a face that was a roadmap of suffering. His eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, were like burnt-out embers in a skull. A thin tube ran from a humming medical device to his nose. This was not a hero. This was the ghost that haunted his own grave. The figure stirred, a dry, rattling cough echoing in the chamber. The embers of his eyes slowly focused on Izuku. A visitor, the voice was a gravelly whisper, a sound like stones grinding together. It has been a long time. Have you come to scavenge? Or have you come to die? Izuku's throat was tight. His mind, usually so quick and analytical, was blank with shock. He was standing before a living legend, and the legend was a corpse that still breathed. "You're Toshinori Yagi," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed the man's gaunt features. "A name I haven't heard in years. I am a guardian. A janitor. Nothing more. State your purpose." Izuku took a deep breath, forcing his mind back into focus. This was it. This was the reason he had risked everything. He stepped forward, pulling notebook 14 from his belt and holding it out. "I came for knowledge," Izuku said, his voice gaining strength. "My home was attacked. We were going to be wiped out. But I made a plan. I used the environment, the enemy's own strengths, against them. We survived. But it's not enough. We need to do more than just survive. We need to rebuild. I came to learn from you. You were the symbol of peace. You knew how to fight. You knew how to win." Toshinori's sunken eyes drifted to the notebook, then back to Izuku's earnest, determined face. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, a sound emerged from his chest, a dry, hacking noise that might have once been a laugh. "Win?" he rasped. He gestured a skeletal hand around the room, at the broken relics, at the oppressive darkness above. "Boy, does this look like victory to you? This is a mausoleum. I am the curator of a failed world. But you defeated him," Izuku pressed, taking another step forward. "The one who caused the eclipse. You saved everyone. I saved no one." Toshinori roared, the sudden volume shocking. He was seized by a violent coughing fit that racked his frail body, and he spat a clot of blood into a handkerchief. He glared at Izuku, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, ancient anger. "I beat him, yes. But the price was the sun. The price was the world. My victory was to sentence humanity to a slow death in the dark instead of a quick one. Some victory." He sank back into his chair, exhausted. "So you outsmarted some petty scavenger king. You made a loud noise and scared him away. What happens when the next one comes? Or the one after that? What happens when something comes that you can't outsmart? A force of nature. A true monster. That's why I'm here," Izuku said, his voice pleading. "To learn how to face them." "There is no how." Toshinori spat. "The age of heroes is over. It was a fool's dream, a child's fantasy. It died on that day, under a black sky." He pointed a trembling, bony finger at Izuku. "You have a spark in you. I can see it. A dangerous, foolish little spark. You call it hope. I call it a disease. It's the same disease that got them all killed." He gestured to a dusty control panel next to his chair and pressed a button. A nearby wall panel hissed open, revealing what was behind it. It wasn't a weapons locker. It was a memorial wall. It was covered in photographs. Pictures of smiling young men and women in bright, colorful costumes. Izuku recognized some of them from old, pre-eclipse data files. A serious boy with glasses and engines on his legs. A cheerful girl with pink skin. A stoic teenager with red and white hair. Over most of the faces, a single, brutal red X had been painted. "Look," Toshinori whispered, his voice cracking with an agony that was 16 years old but still raw. "My students. My friends. The next generation of heroes. They were the best of us. Brave, powerful, full of that same spark you have. They fought. They hoped. And they died." He pointed to a specific photo, one of a fierce, spiky-haired blonde boy, his face set in a determined scowl. The X over his face was thicker, angrier than the others. He fought to the very end, believed he could win against anything. His hope made him incinerate 3 city blocks and everyone in them, himself included, in a final, useless act of defiance. Toshinori's gaze drifted to another part of the wall, where a small audio player was mounted. "You want to know what the end of the Age of Heroes sounds like, boy?" He pressed play. A cacophony of static, screams, and explosions filled the room. A young woman's voice, strained with panic but filled with resolve, cut through the noise. "Gravity is failing. I can't hold the debris much longer. Shoto, we need a wall. Now! A deeper, male voice replied, distorted by flame and fury. OT enough! He's breaking through, I need more. The transmission cut out with a final, wet, tearing sound, followed by an unbearable, piercing shriek of feedback. Toshinori switched it off. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. It was a silence filled with ghosts. That was the last transmission from the Central Command, he said, his voice hollow. The sound of hope dying. I have listened to it every day for 16 years, to remind myself of the price of my failure, the price of believing we could win. He turned his burning, dead eyes back to Izuku. You want my knowledge? Here it is. There is no winning. There is only surviving. You keep your head down. You stay in your hole. You protect what little you have and you pray that nothing stronger finds you. You don't build beacons, boy. Beacons don't create light, they only attract the moths. And in this world, the moths are monsters with teeth of shadow and claws of despair. He slumped back in his chair, the fire in his eyes fading back into embers. Go home. Forget you ever came here. Forget heroes. Bury that spark of yours before it burns you and everyone you care about alive. Izuku stood frozen, the notebook feeling like a lead weight in his hand. Every word Toshinori had spoken was a blow, dismantling his resolve, poisoning his determination. He had come here seeking a sword and had been handed a shroud. He had come seeking a mentor and had found a tombstone. He looked at the broken man in the chair, a relic guarding a room full of ghosts, trapped in a cycle of self-flagellation. He looked at the faces on the wall, the bright, hopeful eyes of the dead. He heard their final, screaming moments. The despair in the room was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that threatened to extinguish his own fragile spark. He had no response. His logic, his analysis, had no counter for this absolute, soul-deep certainty of failure. He had seen the strength of their community, the small flicker of hope they had created. Toshinori had seen the end of the entire world. Whose vision was more true? He walked up the stairs and back out into the perpetual twilight of the Deadlands. He didn't look back at the broken statue of the hero who had failed. He just started the long, lonely walk home, his mind a maelstrom of doubt. He hadn't gotten the answers he wanted. He had been rejected, his hope dismissed as a suicidal delusion. He was dejected, hollowed out, the fire in his gut reduced to a cold, aching pit. But as he navigated the twisted, broken landscape, a new, unwelcome thought began to form. Toshinori was wrong about one thing. Izuku now understood the world's despair better than anyone. He had stared into its heart, had listened to its voice. It was not a monster to be fought with fists and flashy powers. It was a tide, a force of nature. But even the tide had a rhythm. Even the deepest darkness had a shape, and anything with a shape could be measured. Anything that could be measured could be understood, and anything that could be understood could be broken. He left the all-might memorial zone not with the wisdom of a hero, but with the grim, terrible understanding of the enemy. And in a world without light, perhaps that was the more valuable weapon after all. The return journey was a silent pilgrimage through a world of ghosts. Every shadow seemed to hold the echoes of Toshinori Yagi's words, every groan of straining metal sounded like the last, agonized transmission of the fallen heroes. Izuku moved with an automaton's efficiency, his body executing the well-practiced motions of survival, while his mind replayed the scene in the bunker on a torturous loop. Hope is a disease. Beacons don't create light, they only attract the moths. He had gone seeking a weapon and had been told to dig his own grave deeper. He had sought a path forward and had been shown a wall of the dead. The hollowed-out feeling in his gut was no longer the ache of dejection, but the cold, clean emptiness of a problem stripped of all its emotional variables. Toshinori was a monument to a failed methodology, a warning. His despair, while profound and tragic, was also a data point. It was the result of a strategy, head-on confrontation, unwavering hope, symbolic power, that had shattered against the hard reality of the eclipse. Izuku would not make the same mistake. When he finally slipped back into the sanctuary through the hidden entrance, his return was met with a wave of palpable relief. His mother wept, clutching him with a strength that belied her frail frame. Old man Tanaka clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. But the relief was tinged with confusion. They had expected him to return with a legendary weapon, a secret power, or at the very least, a renewed sense of heroic purpose. They saw none of that in his eyes. The boy who had left, though grim, still had a fire in his gaze. The young man who returned was different. The fire was gone, replaced by the flat, chilling glint of polished steel. He was colder, more distant. When he spoke, it was with a clipped, unnerving precision. "He's alive," Izuku announced to the assembled community leaders, Tanaka, Kenji, and Anya. He stood before the large crate table, his pack still on his back. "Tashinori Yagi lives. But he is not a hero, he is a hermit waiting to die." He offered no help. No knowledge. He offered only a warning, to stay hidden, to keep our heads down, and to not draw attention. A heavy silence fell over the small group. Kenji's face, scarred but resolute since the battle, fell. "So that's it, then? There's nothing? The trip was for nothing?" "No," Izuku said, his voice sharp. "The trip was invaluable. It confirmed my hypothesis." He shrugged off his pack and unrolled a large, patched-together map of the surrounding sectors, pinning it to the table. His strategy failed. The old world's strategy failed. Relying on a single, powerful individual. Concentrating all your hope in one symbol. It creates a single point of failure. When that point breaks, the whole system collapses. He tapped the center of the map, right where their sanctuary was located. That's what we are now. A single point. One bad storm, one clever warlord, one new type of Gloomfang, and we will break. He looked at each of them, his gaze intense, demanding. Hiding is not a strategy. It's a prolonged death. Tashinori is wrong. We don't need to dig our hole deeper. We need to dig more holes. Tanaka frowned, leaning over the map. "What are you saying, boy?" "Isolation is a death sentence," Izuku explained, picking up a piece of charcoal and circling their location. "We are an island. Our resources are finite. Our population is stagnant. Our knowledge is limited to what we can find and what Tanaka can remember. To survive, truly survive, we need to become a network." He began to circle other areas on the map, locations where pre-eclipse population density suggested other survivor pockets might exist. Redundancy. Specialization. Trade. If one settlement is attacked, it can be supported by the others. If one finds a new source of food, all benefit. We don't need a single, towering beacon. We need a constellation of smaller, interconnected sparks. The sheer scale of his ambition was breathtaking. He wasn't just talking about defense anymore. He was talking about rebuilding civilization, one desperate, hidden settlement at a time. "You want to go looking for more trouble?" Kenji scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "We just survived an attack that nearly wiped us out. You want to advertise our location to every stray dog in the wreckage?" "No," Izuku countered calmly. "I want to find allies before our enemies find us. I will go alone. I will scout. I will observe. I will not make contact unless I am certain the potential benefits outweigh the risks." His decision was not presented as a matter for debate. It was a statement of fact. He was their leader, and this was their new directive. Over the next week, Izuku prepared. He restocked his supplies, reinforced his gear, and spent hours poring over the map, cross-referencing it with salvaged geological surveys and infrastructure plans. He was methodical, almost obsessive. His mother watched him with a quiet, aching sadness. She had her son back, but the boy she knew was gone, replaced by this grim, calculating general. He set out under the perpetual twilight, a lone figure melting into the skeletal ruins. His first target was a sector to the east, designated on his map as the Muzurifu General Hospital Complex. It was a high-risk, high-reward target. Hospitals were prime scavenging grounds, often picked clean or heavily contested, but they were also built like fortresses, with reinforced structures and potentially deep, secure basements. If a community had managed to fortify one, they would be well defended. The journey took him through territories controlled by minor scavenger clans, forcing him into the city's underbelly, the crumbling sewer systems and dark, flooded subway tunnels. He moved with a practiced silence, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He saw evidence of other survivors, a recently extinguished campfire, fresh footprints. But he avoided them, sticking to his primary objective. After 2 days of tense, silent travel, he reached the hospital complex. It was a graveyard of ambulances and overturned vehicles. The main tower had a colossal bite taken out of its side. The upper floors collapsed into a cascade of rubble that reached halfway down its face. It looked dead, abandoned. But Izuku was patient. He found a high, defensible perch in a building across the street and began his observation. For 12 hours he saw nothing. No movement, no light, no sound. He was beginning to think the location was a bust when he finally saw it. A flicker of movement on the 5th floor, in a section of the building that still looked intact. A figure, small and agile, was rappelling down the side of the building on a makeshift rope. They moved with a practiced ease, retrieving something from a lower floor before ascending again, disappearing back into the shadows of a shattered window. Izuku watched for another full day. He saw more signs of life. A wisp of filtered smoke from a hidden chimney. A brief flash of reflected light, as if from a lookout's binoculars. They were cautious. Organized. He counted at least a dozen distinct individuals over the course of his surveillance. They were a community. His next step was to assess their resources and their needs. He spent the next 3 days in a slow, dangerous circle around the hospital, scouting their perimeter. He found their primary water source, a series of large cisterns on the roof, collecting the toxic, acidic rain. They had a filtration system, but from the sickly, pale look of the few survivors he managed to glimpse up close, it was failing. He saw them tending to a rooftop garden, the plants withered and struggling. He saw signs of sickness. He also saw their strength. He watched, mesmerized, as a small team worked to clear a collapsed hallway. A young woman with a round, gentle face and short brown hair reached out and touched a massive, multi-ton slab of concrete. The slab glowed with a soft pink energy and then, impossibly, lifted into the air as if it were a child's balloon. Other survivors quickly scrambled underneath, shoring up the ceiling with steel beams before she gently set the slab back down, not on the floor, but as a new, reinforced wall. It was a quirk. A powerful one. But she wasn't using it as a weapon. She was using it to build, to rescue, to protect. This was the group he was looking for. Now came the most dangerous part, making contact. He couldn't just walk up to the front door. He'd be shot on sight. He needed to demonstrate value before he even spoke a word. He continued his observations, looking for an opportunity, a problem he could solve for them from the outside. He found it in their patrol routes. A small, 2-person team left the hospital every 12 hours to scavenge in a nearby residential district. Their route was predictable, efficient, but it had a flaw. It took them directly past the collapsed parking garage that, according to his Gloomfang migration data, was a seasonal nesting ground for Type 5 ravagers, fast, pack-hunting creatures that were smaller than scuttlers but far more numerous. The nests were dormant now, but the first shift in barometric pressure would wake them. A storm was due in 2 days. He wouldn't just warn them. He would show them. That night, he crept down to the street level. He found the path the patrol took, and, using a piece of chalk, drew a single, large, clear X on the ground. Next to it, he drew a crude but anatomically precise picture of a ravager. Then, he drew a new path, a series of arrows pointing them towards a longer, but safer, route through a series of interconnected office buildings. He left no note, no signature. Just the information. Then he retreated to his perch and waited. The next morning, the 2-person patrol emerged. They were heavily armed with crude spears and crossbows. As they approached the chalk marks, they stopped. They stared at the drawings for a long time, their weapons held at the ready, scanning the surrounding buildings. They were tense, suspicious. They argued in hushed tones, then one of them spoke into a crackling radio. After a moment, they backed away, retreating the way they came. They didn't take his suggested route. They were too cautious for that. But they hadn't taken their old one either. It was a start. He had proven he was watching, and that he wasn't immediately hostile. Now, for the approach. He chose his time carefully. Midday, when the perpetual twilight was at its brightest. He stripped himself of his main pack and most of his weapons, keeping only his knife and notebook. 14. He walked out into the middle of the street, his hands raised and empty, and approached the hospital's main entrance, a fortified barricade of welded cars and sharpened rebar. "I am a scout," he called out, his voice steady, projecting but not yelling. "My name is Izuku. I am alone, and I am unarmed. I am the one who left the warning." He could feel dozens of unseen eyes on him. The silence was heavy, menacing. He stood perfectly still, alone, non-threatening figure in the urban wasteland. He was offering them a choice. They could shoot him, or they could talk to him. After a long, tense minute, a section of the barricade slid open with a screech of protesting metal. Two figures emerged, their faces obscured by makeshift gas masks, their crossbows leveled at his chest. Behind them stood the woman with the gravity quirk. She wore no mask. Her round face was set in a firm, determined line, her brown eyes narrowed with suspicion. She was clearly the one in charge. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Who are you, and why are you watching my people?" "I lead a community to the west," Izuku replied, keeping his hands where she could see them. "We are secure, but we are isolated. I am scouting for other pockets of survivors. Potential allies." The woman, Ochako Uraraka, though he did not yet know her name, exchanged a look with one of her guards. "Allies? Or targets? If you were a target, you wouldn't have known I was here until my people were inside your walls," Izuku said, his tone blunt and matter-of-fact. The statement hung in the air, a cold and undeniable assertion of his competence. Her eyes hardened. "You left the drawing. How did you know about the Ravagers?" "I study them. I track their migration patterns, their nesting habits, their weaknesses," he said, tapping the notebook at his belt. "Just as I've studied your settlement for the past 4 days. I know your water filtration is failing. I can see the signs of dysentery in the faces of your people. I know you're low on broad-spectrum antibiotics, and that your rooftop garden is failing due to nutrient-poor soil." The two guards tensed, their crossbows tightening on him. He had just confirmed he was a spy, and a damned good one. But Ochako held up a hand, her expression unreadable. "You know a lot," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "What do you want?" "An alliance," Izuku said, finally laying his cards on the table. "A trade. Your community has skills mine lacks. Advanced medical knowledge. A powerful construction and rescue quirk. Manpower. My community has what you need. A surplus of scavenged supplies. Functioning water purifiers. And me. I can provide strategy, intelligence, and a guaranteed safe route to a clean, pre-eclipse underground reservoir less than a day's travel from here." Ochako stared at him, her mind clearly working fast. Everything he said was true. Her people were getting sicker. Their last scavenging run for medicine had cost them 2 lives. He was offering a solution to her most critical problems. But the offer came from a ghost who had appeared out of nowhere, a boy who spoke of alliances with the cold precision of a warlord negotiating a treaty. "Bring him inside," she commanded her guards. "Search him. If he so much as twitches, put a bolt in him." Izuku offered no resistance as the guards roughly patted him down, confiscating his knife. They led him through the barricade and into the hospital's lobby. The inside was a hive of activity. It was cleaner and more organized than he had expected. Wounded and sick lay on cots, tended to by people using salvaged medical equipment. A makeshift forge glowed in one corner, a man with powerfully built arms hammering a piece of scrap metal into a tool. It was a community, buzzing with a desperate, resilient life. It was a place of healing, even as it was surrounded by death. They took him to a small, secure office that served as Ochako's command center. Maps and supply inventories were tacked to the walls. She sat down behind a metal desk, her 2 guards standing behind her. Another man, built like a mountain with a kind but weary face, joined them. "This is Sato," Ochako said, gesturing to the large man. "He runs our workshop. You say you can fix our water problem. How?" "Your cisterns collect rainwater, which is full of toxins and heavy metals," Izuku began, slipping into his familiar analytical mode. "Your current filters can't handle the particulate load. I can design and help you build a multi-stage filtration system using materials you already have." sand, gravel, charcoal from your forge, and boiled cloth. It's a low-tech but highly effective solution. It will give you potable water within a day. Sato grunted, his arms crossed. Sounds too simple. We've tried charcoal before. It helps, but it's not enough. You weren't using it correctly, Izuku stated, his confidence absolute. The order of the layers, the grade of the materials, and the flow rate are all critical. I can show you. Ochako was quiet for a long moment. And this reservoir? You're sure it's safe? And uncontaminated? Positive, Izuku said. It's a sealed, subterranean municipal water tank. I have the schematics. The route is dangerous, but I have mapped a path through the sewer system that avoids the major Gloomfang territories. She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her gaze pinning him in place. This was the real test. Why? Why risk coming here? Why offer all this to strangers? No one does anything for free in this world. Izuku met her gaze without flinching. I told you. I'm building a network. Your community is valuable. Your medical expertise and your quirk, he nodded at her, are assets that would strengthen the whole. This isn't charity. It is a strategic investment in my own people's survival. I help you, you get stronger. Then you help us. His cold, brutal honesty was more convincing than any lie could have been. He wasn't appealing to her better nature. He was appealing to her pragmatic need to keep her people alive. He was speaking her language, the language of a leader in a world without mercy. All right, Izuku the strategist, Ochako said, a flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect, in her eyes. Here's my offer. You will help Sato build this filter of yours. You will not be armed, and you will be guarded at all times. If it works, if it gives us clean water, I will consider your proposal. If it's a trick, or if you try anything, my people are very good at making problems disappear. Acceptable, Izuku said with a nod. Let's get to work. The next 24 hours were a test. Izuku, under the watchful, suspicious eyes of Sato and another guard, was put to work in the hospital's workshop. He didn't just give orders. He drew the schematics on a piece of slate, and then helped with the physical labor himself. He directed Sato's team in cutting open large barrels, layering them with precisely graded gravel and sand they sterilized in the forge. He showed them how to crush the charcoal to the correct consistency and pack it into a dense, purifying layer. His knowledge was undeniable. He spoke of flow dynamics, particle cohesion, and microbial contaminants with the authority of a pre-eclipse engineer. Sato, initially hostile, slowly grew impressed. The boy was a prodigy, a walking encyclopedia of survival. He didn't just know what to do, he understood why it worked. By nightfall, the system was complete. They funneled a bucket of the foul, sludgy rainwater from the cisterns into the top. It percolated slowly through the layers. What dripped out of the spigot at the bottom was clear, clean, and free of the chemical smell that usually tainted their water. An old woman, a former chemist, ran a series of crude tests on it with a salvaged kit. It's clean, she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice filled with disbelief. It's actually clean. A wave of hushed, joyous murmurs spread through the onlookers. For the first time, Izuku saw genuine smiles on their faces. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. It wasn't the fiery passion Tashinori had warned him against. It was a quiet, satisfying click, the sound of a complex mechanism finally slotting into place. Ochako observed it all, her expression thoughtful. She had provided her people with a home, with safety. But this boy, this stranger, had just given them back a fundamental necessity they had almost forgotten. He had given them clean water. The next day, she granted him the second test. She would accompany him to the reservoir. She assembled a small, elite team, herself, Sato, a quiet, observant girl with frog-like features named Tsuyu Azui, and 2 other guards. Izuku was given back his knife, a sign of conditional trust. You lead, Ochako said to him at the sewer entrance. But know this. We all know this route. If you lead us into a trap, you'll be the first to die. Izuku simply nodded and descended into the darkness. The journey was tense and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the stench of decay. They moved in near total silence, guided by the dim, flickering beam of Izuku's crank-powered flashlight. He led them through a maze of tunnels, his path sure and certain. Twice he held up a hand, freezing them in place. They would hear the distant clicking of a scuttler pack or the low moan of something large and unseen in a parallel tunnel. He would wait, motionless, for the sounds to fade before leading them down a different path. His knowledge of the underbelly of the city was absolute. During one of these enforced halts, crouched in the oppressive darkness, Ochako finally spoke to him in a low whisper. "Why do you do it?" "Really?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "It's not just strategy. I saw your face when the water filter worked. You're not as cold as you pretend to be." Izuku was silent for a moment, the darkness making the confession easier. "I met one of the old heroes," he murmured, the words tasting like rust. "The last one. He told me hope was a disease, that trying to build anything was just making a bigger target. He told me to stay in my hole and die quietly." He paused, the memory of Tashinori's skeletal face vivid in his mind. He might be right. But my people, they deserve more than just a quiet death. They deserve a chance. Not a hope. A chance. An equation with a variable that isn't zero. Ochako considered his words. "I don't think hope is a disease," she whispered back. "I think it's the only thing we have left. It's why I get up every day, why I use my quirk to lift rubble instead of crush skulls. It's not just about surviving, Izuku. It's about living. It's about building a place where a kid can be a kid, even for a few minutes. That's worth fighting for." Here it was. The fundamental difference between them. He was the head, the cold, calculating brain focused on the mathematical probability of survival. She was the heart, the warm, beating pulse focused on the quality of that survival. And in the suffocating darkness of the sewer, Izuku realized with a startling clarity that one was useless without the other. They reached the reservoir an hour later. It was exactly as he'd described, a massive, sealed concrete tank, accessed by a maintenance shaft. The water inside was cool, clean, and plentiful. As Sato and the others began to fill their containers, Ochako stood beside Izuku, looking back down the dark tunnel they had come from. "You've kept your word," she said. "Twice." She turned to him and held out a hand, her glove stained with grime. "My name is Ochako Uraraka. We will be your allies." Izuku looked at her outstretched hand. He thought of Tashinori's memorial wall, of the red X's over the faces of his fallen allies. He thought of the risk, of the moths drawn to the flame. Then he looked at Ochako's face, her expression open and determined, and he saw not a liability, but a vital, missing piece of his own equation. He took her hand. His grip was firm, sealing the first pact of a new world. The return to the hospital was a quiet triumph. The news of a source of endless clean water, and an alliance with another group, sent a wave of genuine, unrestrained joy through the community. That evening, the leaders of both settlements met via a crackling long-range radio that Tanaka and Sato managed to get working. They spoke for hours, sharing information, resources, and for the first time in a long time, a shared sense of possibility. Before he left to return to his own people, Izuku stood with Ochako on the hospital roof, looking out at the skeletal ruins of the city. "We need a name," Ochako said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Not just the hospital group or the subway dwellers. Something to call this alliance. Something for people to rally to." "Names are a liability," Izuku said reflexively. "They create a target. Or they create a destination," she countered, turning to him with a small, defiant smile. "Tashinori told you that beacons attract monsters. But he's wrong. A beacon isn't for the monsters, Izuku. It's for the lost. It's a signal to other people like us that they're not alone." She looked at him, her brown eyes seeming to glow in the dim light. "You're the one who found us. You're the one connecting the sparks. You're the beacon." Izuku felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't from fear. Her words reframed everything. A beacon wasn't a symbol of arrogant power like All Might had been. It was a simple point of light in the darkness. A guide. A promise. "Beacon," he said, testing the word. It felt right. It felt possible. He left the hospital not just with an alliance, but with a new purpose. He wasn't just building a network anymore. He was building a beacon in the dark, and for the first time since he'd stood in the ghost of All Might's tomb, he felt the cold, hard certainty in his gut warm into something that felt dangerously, terrifyingly, like hope.